Good morning. Uh, my name is George Williams. I'm from Palm Beach, Florida, and I'm here to tell you about a very interesting subject. And I have to tell you, this is a new computer, and when I bought it, there was something wrong with it. So I took it back to the Best Buy store, and I said, "Something wrong." And he said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Well, I turn it on and it sings to me." He says, "What do you expect? It's a Dell." That's the only one, okay. Um, well, I mean, I have a couple more if you want, but all right. Uh, During the 1970s and 1980s, it was a very peculiar time for the Palm Beaches because due to the lack of federal and state and regulatory oversight, the drug cartel was able to use Palm Beach to its great advantage. And a big part of the reason was that for all the years that they tried to interdict shipments, the focus was on Miami. And the theory was, okay, drugs come into Miami and they're shipped north and then out to the rest of the country. And so there was a lot of activity in stopping cars and vans and trucks. And I can remember driving up I-95 and there would be a sign that says, drug check 5 miles. But there'd be an exit right there, and of course that's where they were. But the reason why it was so successful in Palm Beach County is because no vehicles were ever checked that were heading south. So the drugs just came flowing into Palm Beach County, and they went south to Miami to be distributed then. Now, when I wrote this book, Snow on the Palms, which is in the bookstore, by the way, for only $15, all right, they told me that in the bookstores in Palm Beach, people were coming in and riffing through it to see if their names were in it. And there were quite a few, because, I told the truth of what had happened. But to take you back to the year 1973, that's when I personally moved to Palm Beach. And this is a shot of the Breakers Resort and Hotel, which is a landmark you may know from. It's a pretty famous hotel. It still exists. It still costs a fortune to go there. And another funny thing about the Breakers is that beach in front of it sometimes disappears when there's a storm. And if you paid a lot of money to go there and there's no beach, it's kind of, so they're always renourishing that beach. But in the year that I moved there, 1973, it was a pretty isolated place because I-95, which runs, of course, up and down the East Coast, wasn't connected. And because of politics, it only went down, it stopped before Palm Beach County. And so there was no way for the heavy traffic to get into the Palm Beaches except by US 1, which was just a series of stoplights, and it's very slow. So I-95 was not connected, and travel across the state through the Everglades was medieval, and it remains that way. So Palm Beach was kind of isolated. I don't know if you're too familiar with it, but the city of West Palm Beach, which is on the mainland, because of course Palm Beach is an island, was really started as a service where the service people lived for the families that were in Palm Beach, which still remains fabulously wealthy to this day. And of course, we have to put up with the Donald, but it's the price of paradise, So in 1973, drug smuggling was alive and well in Palm Beach County, and it was really a growth industry. When I moved there, I had an aircraft, and I based it at a small airfield, which was on the mainland, and it was right on the edge of the Everglades. Today it's all built up, but back then it wasn't. It was right on the edge. And it was a very small airfield, and maybe 40, 50 planes there. None of them were very big because it was a short runway, and it was called Gardens Aviation. Gardens Airport was the name of the place, and I had no idea what I was getting into or what went on. And I'll show you, in case you're not too familiar, here's where the airport is. And Palm Beach is just off the coast there. So, and Miami is down about, see if this works, around there, about 80 miles to Miami. So that was the situation back then. It was an ideal base for drug smuggling because it was so isolated. And later on, Sheriff Richard Willey of Palm Beach County said, and he wasn't too far wrong, every pilot who, with a plane at that airport became a millionaire. And pretty much true. And it was done in a very open manner, pretty much. You've read about drug planes that dropped their loads out the doors and this and that. That really didn't happen in Palm Beach County very much because they would just land, wait till nightfall, and then they'd light the field. The field had no lights. So whatever vehicle was going to transport the drugs would show up, put their lights on the plane, and they would unload it. And sometimes, you know, the cops might help. And they would take the stuff down south to Miami. And they used trucks and vans and tow vehicles. And the cartel actually owned a couple of towing companies so that the paperwork to tow the vehicles, and a big favorite was a milk truck, because you take a milk truck and you put it on a tow truck, and it would hold a lot of, at that time it was marijuana, it would hold a lot of grass, and then the tow truck would take it down to Miami, and all the paperwork was filled out properly, so in case they were ever stopped, which they never were, it would look okay unless they searched the inside of the milk truck. So it's really done, as I say, at night. And if planes would come in during the day and sort of staggered throughout the day, they would all unload at night. And it was kind of a big, I wouldn't say party, but it was a big event when that happened. That's the end of the runway before the paving started. And you can see it's kind of scrubby and out in the middle of nowhere. Now, as I said, law enforcement was really non-existent, and depending on where you were, like for instance, in Miramar, north of Miami, they would do the loading and unloading behind the police station because it was a very safe place to do it. And the other thing, this airport was owned by one of the 3 richest men in the United States. And if I tell you it's John D., you're probably going to get it wrong, because it's John D. MacArthur, the insurance tycoon, who in today's dollars was worth $23 billion. And I think Mac, as everybody called him, knew that what was going on at that airfield because he wouldn't put his name on the strip. So it was just called Gardens Aviation, Gardens Airport. Now, he was a pretty interesting guy, and there have been books written about him because he made his money in insurance, and fabulously wealthy, and he lived in a little dump of a house in a little dumpy town called Lake Park. And his office was in this hotel, which was his hotel on the beach, called the Colonnades. And it would be equivalent to like a Howard Johnson or a Holiday Inn. It really wasn't very luxurious. And his office was a Formica table in the coffee shop. So if you wanted to talk to Mac or do a deal with him, you'd go to the coffee shop and have a cup of coffee with him. And he was very, very approachable, very accessible guy. And at one point, the feds said to him, we'd like to put a surveillance radar installation in the top up there of the Colonnades. It's fun to use this thing, you know. And they did, and it was about an hour before all the pilots learned what was going on, and so avoided the cone that radar covered. So they were always like one step ahead. So the couriers quickly found that out. This is a kind of a map of where the smuggling came from. Now, right now, of course, we're below Cuba at this moment, but these islands of the Bahamas, and yesterday we were over here in Princess Key, which is at the, what did I just do? I don't know. Okay. That's where Princess Key really is, in the bottom of Eleuthera. It's not an island or anything. And I don't know if, and maybe you took a tour of the place. It's an interesting island. But there were 3 primary islands that were used to smuggle marijuana into Florida. And they would arrive by, the marijuana would arrive to these islands by, usually by boat, through the Bahamas. And yeah, the boats had to be careful because Fidel was in the business too. And if you got too close to Cuba, he would confiscate your vessel. And he had quite a fleet of yachts that were intercepted that contained marijuana that he, of course, resold, you know. And one of the favorite boats was the aluminum striker yachts, and they would paint the waterline high so that when they loaded the thing so heavily with drugs, it would look like it wasn't riding very low, and they would take it up to these 3 islands. Now, this guy up here, well, the 3 islands are Norman's Key, Great Harbor, and Gorda Key. The reason Gorda Key, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Now, one of the local people at that time was F. Lee Bailey, and he had a condominium in Great Harbor. And he took exception to the fact that the smugglers were using it to run drugs through Great Harbor. So he protested to Prime Minister Pindling about it. And about a week later, they blew up his condo. So he learned really quickly that being a famous lawyer in the United States didn't cut much ice with the drug guys, drug crowd. Now, the reason that this has the Mickey Mouse ears is because that's what it became. If you take a Disney cruise, you may stop at what they now call Castaway Cay, but its real name was Gorda Cay, and it was a very active drug smuggling center. So if you happen to be on a Disney cruise and you get off, you might see, oh wow, look what they've done. They put all these things in here for local color, and it's quite an exhibit. No, that's the real thing. That's a drug plane that crashed, and most of them crashed on takeoff, not because the pilots were high on their own stuff, because they would overload the plane. And so most of the wrecks, plane wouldn't fly. It was too heavy. So they would wind up barely making it into the air and then right into the water. The main destination for the Palm Beaches was a place called Cat Island. And let's see. Yeah, there it is. All right. Now you can see that from Florida, and here's, say, Palm Beach right here, a pilot flying down to there was hardly ever out of sight of land. And all these islands had airstrips, and they still do have airstrips. So it wasn't a very dangerous flight. In fact, it's a beautiful flight. So for the average aircraft, let's say it's 325 miles, so maybe 2.5 hours in a small single-engine plane, which they don't fly very fast. So it's a real pretty flight down, and they would, when a mothership would come in with a load of marijuana, all the pilots at Gardens Aviation would take off and head down to Cat Island and load up. And it was kind of a party atmosphere, and then they would fly back, and they would land back at Gardens, and they wouldn't unload until night, and then they would all get unloaded at once. And so it was kind of a regular routine type of thing. It was a very busy way station. And the airport there was New Bight Airport, which is still there. Still there. So now, what were the risks of flying drugs for the cartels? Well, law enforcement was very modest if you were from the Palm Beach area. In fact, it was non-existent. Accidents were low, but if they were, it was because they were overloaded. The pilots took care of their airplanes, so mechanical failures were few, and there was no violence from the Bahamas. Now, the interesting thing is that even though cartels went to war with each other, and you've probably seen some of the specials on it, the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel that came along later, the pilots were pretty much held as off limits because they all needed pilots, and the pilots were treated very well. So there was violence was not a factor for this. Now, there was the risk. Here are some examples. You can see this guy never made it off the island, and I don't think he made out too well personally, the way that looks. I know this guy did not make out very well. He never made it off the island. Here's another wreck. And here's finally a fourth one. Now, most of the time, the Bahamians would try to get out to where the boat went down immediately and salvage the cargo. So if the cartel tried to get their drugs back from the plane that had crashed, and usually they were in shallow water, they had to be really quick. This is actually me before my hair turned white. And that's in 35 feet of water, a plane that crashed off the runway, and it was empty by the time anybody found out about it. Now this next slide is really interesting because this is off of Chub Key, and the year was 1975, in 35 feet of water. Now, while the risk of being shot down on the Bahamian runs was non-existent, that wasn't the case with Central or South America when the business turned into cocaine. And that was in the late 70s and 80s. And this is a CIA film, only lasts a few seconds. This guy made it within 2 miles of the Panamanian border in safety. He's being pursued by that plane, which is Panamanian, and he's just been shot. And the CIA is following in a chase plane, and he went down there. Did not have a good day. Yeah. Now, the reason that the reason that Panama was so dangerous was because our friend General Noriega was in the drug business. And the more he could shoot down or interdict, the more money he would make from his own operation. So Panama was a very dangerous place. And as the business moved south to Colombia, it became a place to avoid. So let's see how much money we're talking about. Now, well, let me tell you a little bit about the pilots. Most of these guys were fairly young guys, adventurous types, but they were not rich by any means, and the planes they owned were single engine, maybe $40,000, $50,000. They had invested in them, and when the opportunity to make money like this came along for a day's flight, it was pretty tempting, and there weren't very many pilots that would say, that's not for me, especially when nobody got caught. So, then the other guys would say, what's the matter with you? We're all... And these guys looked at it like they were hauling grain or flour, because any of the drug violence was down south in Miami, where they were, the Cubans were killing the Colombians, and the Colombians were killing the Cubans, and it became an incredible mess. But in the Palm Beaches, there was none of that. So they were very removed from the effects of the drugs. And as a result, they never really thought about what they were hauling. You know, it was just like grain or cargo or anything else. So a typical single-engine plane like that could hold almost 1,000 pounds if you took the seats out, the other seats out, and say 18 bales of Columbia Red, and there are the prices there. So the guy made $100,000 for a few hours' work and an awfully pretty flight on the way down. So, but then it changed. The Colombians started putting cocaine in the shipments of marijuana. They didn't know whether it would sell. We're talking the early 70s now. But they said, hey, if you can sell it, you know, we'll try. They had dealers in the States, so they did. Well, it took about a minute before the whole product switched from marijuana to cocaine because it was the money was so incredible. So if we take our same aircraft that could hold maybe 800 to 900 pounds of product, that would be, say, 44 kilos. And that plane was having $29 million worth of drugs, a small plane, a street price. That's what the pilot got. Now, how many guys resisted that? It's a longer flight, though, and there was some risk, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the scene got even more crazy, got more surreal, because as Colombians started making so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. They had no use for dollars. Colombians couldn't use dollars. They had to buy paste. They had to bribe governments. They had to do this and that. And that was not done in dollars. It was done in pesos. But they didn't trust anybody in the States to change the money. So would you guys like to fly cash down to us? How much cash? Well, try as much as your plane will hold in $100 bills. Oh, okay. So now, a dollar bill weighs a gram. So a $100 bill weighs a gram, right? 1 gram. So the average small plane could carry 44 million down to Colombia in cash, if the bills were dry. And that courier fee worked out to be the exact same amount, because $3,000 a kilo was the price to take it up to the States, and that worked out to the same exact number as 3% of that. So now, here we have a pilot who could make twice that in one run, right? Bringing down cash, bringing up the drugs. Now this is what the cartel was taking in every single day at the height of this. They didn't know what to do with it either. They had warehouses, and they had actually, and this is documented in movies like Cocaine Cowboys, which, if you've seen, was pretty accurate. Okay, they would have warehouses that were full of money, and they would say, okay, we're going to say 5% loss because of rats that would chew up that much money. And it was all worked out, and the thing was like a crazy dream, you know. And in fact, the cartel guys, especially the Medellin cartel, these were not college professors, all right? They were criminals that suddenly all these extra zeros, and they had all this money, and they had to move product from A to B, and that's all they had to do, because they could grow it with impunity, right? And so it was a pretty simple business. And every time the feds tried one thing, they would try another thing, and they kept trying things that would work. And they could take losses, of course, you know. Now, if you were a pilot hauling cash, and that was not every pilot, only a few pilots got to attain the trust to haul cash. You didn't want to not show up with money down in Colombia. It did not matter what happened. If you had mechanical trouble, crashed into the ocean, fled somewhere else, or crashed into the sea, your family was killed. Period. The end. And every time that happened, the other pilots were informed. So nobody would really steal any of this money. So now on these double runs we talked about, the whole run from Florida to, say, Medellin there is 1,300 miles. And most of the pilots would stop off halfway because, well, they had to stop halfway because their planes wouldn't go that far on a single load of fuel. And that would usually, that would be in Central America, on Honduras, usually. Stay overnight, refuel, and head down. And the cash was dropped off in Medellin, where the cartel was located, the Medellin cartel. And then the pilot would fly 310 miles north to Santa Marta, where the refining was done, pick up the load of cocaine, and fly back home. And it was very important not to brush by Panama there, as we said, because they were very active and the CIA also was cooperating with Panama to try to interdict any aircraft coming in. So it was a little bit of discomfort there as you went by Panama. So, as we've said, now how many of those do you have to do in a year? Really? So the many pilots, I'm talking in Gardens Aviation, one run a year, you know? But what would happen would be, it was funny, a guy would do a run, pick up the money. Well, first of all, he had to figure out what to do with it. And that's not so easy as cash like that builds up. You know, it's not going to fit in a safety deposit box. If you rent a storage locker, well, okay. But that's why there were so many banks in Miami that if you went down Brickell Avenue during the 70s and 80s, you'd see all these banks with strange names like Central Bank of Medellin or Colombian Trust or whatever. And they were just one-room banks with counting machines. And the dealers would come in and deposit the money, and they would go through the counting machines. But the pilots generally, they were worried because if the feds ever found out their accounts in these banks, that was the only way they could be traced. So it was a problem that endured the whole time. What do you do with the money? And as it built up, if you do one run, and what happens, human nature, you know, a guy might do a run and say, okay, I'm done for the year, but maybe 3-4 months later, he said, well, you know, I did. And they would do more than one a year. I don't know. It took a little self-discipline to only do one a year. Okay. This is the dirtiest bank of all. The real name was Bank of Credit and Commerce, but it was nicknamed the Bank of Crooks and Criminals. And it laundered money for Miami. And they had roomfuls of counting machines. And because of the rule that you have to report $10,000 of deposits in a single deposit of cash, the guys would have cardboard boxes filled with like $9,900 and go into the bank, make the deposit, go out to their truck, get another box, and this went on until they, you know, deposited all the money. And so the other bank was that became used was Noriega's bank, because Noriega played every end against the middle. He offered the pilots and anybody else safe haven if you put your money into the Panama City branch of that BCCI bank. and in return, you had to pay him 3%. Well, most pilots, you know, they weren't really sophisticated financial people, so okay, that's what I'll do. So it was estimated that the Panama City branch took in $2 billion, of which Noriega's share was $60 million. And not only that, as you may know, he was paid $275,000 a year by you and me as a CIA informant. So this guy was really, and there he is with President Bush, who, of course, used to be a head of the CIA, and I guess that's how I knew him. But it got so bad that, of course, it started that war, and we raided Panama and, you know, bombed the wrong places, and it was kind of messy, but took Noriega as captive, where he's still serving time someplace. And that's a little bit of humor. Don't know where that guy came from. All right. So for anybody that is interested in aircraft, this is a typical courier aircraft, single-engine plane, very popular with drug smugglers and undertakers, particularly because it can carry a lot, and it had these very wide double doors, so a coffin would be able to fit in there. So undertakers and smugglers bought a lot of these Cherokee 6s. The plane I had was the version of this that was retractable. That is a fixed gear aircraft. As you can see, the wheels don't come up. And I'll just give you some numbers. I don't want to bore you, but just to tell you quickly, if you took the seats out in the back and your payload with full fuel would be 924 pounds. It cruised at 168 miles an hour, which was pretty leisurely, carried 83 gallons of fuel, so it could run 840 miles with an hour reserve fuel. The disadvantages were that for pilots that dumped their product, it was a low-wing airplane. So, you know, it's pretty hard to do this. And you needed a co-pilot. So that meant that the weight of the co-pilot or your passenger, the guy who dumps the stuff out, you have to subtract that from what you can carry. So that's why the pilots really like landing rather than just dumping the stuff. But it could carry a little bit more than the retractable version because the retractable version has motors to make the wheels go up, and that weighed something, you know. But the real big disadvantage of this aircraft is this fact that if you had a ditch, you'd probably flip because the wheels would catch and flip you over. And that happened to several pilots, whereas if you came in with the wheels up, you'd skid to a stop on the top of the water. So